Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of history's most baffling and utterly wild tales. Imagine, if you will, the soft lapping of waves against an ancient Roman quay, the scent of salt and fish mingling with exotic spices, and then picture right there, in the shimmering Mediterranean sun, an emperor, cloaked in purple, gazing out at the endless blue with an almost unsettling glint in his eye. He's not contemplating naval strategy, you see. He's dreaming of something far more unique, something involving a creature of the deep, a creature whose intelligence and grace captivate him in a way no human ever could. We're talking about an emperor who truly, genuinely, perhaps pathologically, tried to marry a dolphin. Yes, you heard that right. A dolphin. You probably won't survive this journey with your common sense intact, but hey, that's half the fun, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and local time in the comments. It's always cool to see where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not by chariot, but by the subtle currents of time, to the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically to the late 2nd century CE. The air in Rome is thick with the scent of pine and incense, a hum of activity always present, even under the calmest of skies. You're walking through grand marble arches, past bustling forums, and beneath the shadow of colossal temples, dedicated to gods, both benevolent and terrifying. This is the Rome of the Antonine dynasty, a period often hailed as the Pax Romana, a golden age of stability and prosperity. But beneath this veneer of peace, a storm was brewing, and its name was Commodus. You see, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the stoic paragon, had a son. That son was Commodus. And while Marcus Aurelius spent his days contemplating virtue and penning his timeless meditations, Commodus was, well, let's just say he was less inclined towards quiet contemplation and more drawn to other pursuits. From a young age, Commodus stood out, and not always in the way a doting imperial father might hope. He wasn't particularly interested in the finer points of governance, the delicate dance of diplomacy, or the weight of empire. His interests leaned, shall we say, a little more kinetic. Imagine a young Commodus, perhaps 12 or 13, already tall and powerfully built, ignoring the dusty scrolls of rhetoric for the thrill of the hunt. You can picture him, can't you? Already with that wild glint in his eye, perhaps running through the imperial gardens, practicing with a javelin, or sparring with a seasoned gladiator, long before such activities were deemed appropriate for a future emperor. This wasn't just youthful exuberance. It was a deep-seated inclination towards the physical, the dramatic, the overtly powerful. Mainstream historical fact. Commodus was indeed the first biological son of a reigning emperor to succeed his father in almost a century, breaking the tradition of adopting competent heirs, which many historians point to as a significant turning point in Rome's decline. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. It's rumored that as a child, Commodus once had a bath attendant scalded to death because the bath water was too hot. Just a little glimpse into his future management style, wouldn't you say? It's enough to make you think twice about complaining about your shower temperature, isn't it? This story, whether entirely true or apocryphal, certainly paints a vivid picture of a young man who lacked the stoic self-control of his father. Historians still argue whether Commodus was truly mad from the outset, or if the immense pressure of the emperorship, combined with his inherent personality traits, gradually pushed him over the edge. Was it nature or nurture, or a toxic cocktail of both, that led him down such an unconventional path? You can almost hear the hushed whispers in the imperial court, even then, as courtiers exchanged nervous glances, wondering what fresh eccentricity their young prince would unveil next. It was a slow burn, this descent, but the embers were already glowing brightly in his youth, long before the idea of exchanging vows with a creature of the sea ever entered his mind. You might even feel a shiver tracing its way down your spine, just imagining the weight of expectation on his young shoulders, and how spectacularly he managed to shrug it off in favor of, well, you'll see. The seeds of his bizarre reign were sown early, in a privileged but perhaps ultimately suffocating environment, leading to a mind that would defy all convention, even especially the very fabric of Roman imperial dignity. As Commodus matured, the weight of the imperial purple settled upon him, not as a symbol of duty, but as a costume for his grand, personal play. You're standing now in the opulent chambers of the imperial palace, the air thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, the soft murmur of courtiers, a constant backdrop to the emperor's increasingly unpredictable moods. When Marcus Aurelius finally passed, after years of campaigning on the Danube frontier, Rome held its breath. Would Commodus, now solely at the helm, finally embrace the sober responsibilities of his lineage? You see, Marcus Aurelius was a towering figure, both intellectually and morally. He embodied the ideal of the philosopher-king, a ruler who sought wisdom and justice above all else. His reign was marked by difficult wars and a devastating plague, yet he faced these challenges with stoic resolve. Commodus, on the other hand, inherited an empire at peace, but his father's legacy was a shadow he could never quite escape, or perhaps never truly wanted to. He was the son of a godlike figure, and in his mind, he too was destined for divinity, but of a far more flashy kind. Instead of stoicism, Commodus embraced the spectacle. Instead of deep thought, he craved immediate gratification. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperated senators as he began to divest himself of the more tedious aspects of governance. He delegated heavily, often to opportunistic favorites, allowing them to accumulate vast wealth and power while he indulged his passions. It was as if he saw the Roman Empire not as a vast, complex political entity, but as his own private playground, complete with all the toys and entertainment he could desire. A mainstream historical fact here, Commodus swiftly abandoned his father's cautious and defensive foreign policy, opting instead for a quick and arguably ignominious peace treaty with the Germanic tribes on the Danube, effectively ending the Marcomannic Wars that Marcus Aurelius had fought for years. This decision, while bringing immediate peace, was seen by many as a betrayal of his father's efforts and a sign of Commodus's disinterest in military matters that didn't involve him personally. Now, for a quirky tidbit, one of Commodus's most infamous early acts was to change the name of the month of September to Commodus, October to Hercules, after his self-proclaimed divine ancestor, Hercules, November to notorious, meaning supreme or overcoming, December to Amazonius, after his favorite Amazonian bodyguard, Marcia, January to Lucius, and February to A. Can you imagine explaining that to your Roman calendar app? Sorry, honey, it's not October, it's Hercules. Get with the times. It's enough to make you chuckle, isn't it? Thinking about how confused everyone must have been. Historians still argue whether Commodus's early actions were a deliberate rejection of his father's legacy, a naive attempt to establish his own identity, or simply the unchecked impulsiveness of a young man suddenly wielding absolute power. Was he actively trying to undo all that Marcus Aurelius had built, or was he merely too self-absorbed to understand the consequences of his whims? You might feel a pang of sympathy, briefly, for the young man thrust into a role he seemed ill-suited for, before remembering the peculiar path he chose to walk. The pressure of inheriting such a revered position, coupled with his own peculiar inclinations, undoubtedly contributed to his erratic behavior. He was a square peg in the round hole of Roman imperial tradition, and he was determined to reshape the whole to fit himself, no matter how much splintering it caused. He seemed to view the Roman Empire not as a responsibility, but as a personal stage, and he was just getting started with his performance. You find yourself now in the heart of the Colosseum, the roar of the crowd, a deafening wave that washes over you. The sun beats down on the sand, stained crimson from previous battles, and the air crackles with anticipation. But this isn't just any gladiatorial contest. This is a performance orchestrated by the emperor himself, and he is the star. Commodus, you see, wasn't content merely to watch gladiators. He believed he was a gladiator, the greatest of them all, a living embodiment of Hercules, the demigod of strength and courage. Imagine the scene. Commodus, resplendent in golden armor, his face partially obscured by a magnificent helmet, strides into the arena. He's not here to oversee, he's here to fight. And not against worthy opponents, mind you. He prefers to dispatch animals, often exotic and defenseless, or, even more disturbingly, the disabled and infirm. You can almost feel the unease rippling through the crowd, a mixture of awe, fear, and disgust. This wasn't the noble spectacle they were accustomed to. This was a grotesque parody, a display of power untempered by any sense of decency. His obsession with Hercules was all-consuming. He commissioned statues of himself as the demigod, carrying a club and wearing a lion skin. He renamed the Roman months in Hercules' honor. Remember Hercules? And he even claimed that he was Hercules reborn. You can picture him, can't you? Striking heroic poses, flexing his impressive physique, convinced that he was divinely favored, a force of nature unleashed upon the world. It's almost comical, this self-aggrandizement, if it weren't so deeply unsettling. Mainstream historical fact: Commodus officially declared the beginning of a new era, renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana, Commodus's colony, and even attempting to rename the Roman Senate as the Commodian Senate. This grandiose act reveals the extent of his megalomania and his desire to reshape the Roman world in his own image. Here's a quirky tidbit. Commodus was said to have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of animals in the arena, including giraffes, elephants, and even a hippopotamus. One account claims he shot 100 bears in a single day. You might raise an eyebrow at that, picturing the sheer logistical nightmare of corralling that many bears, let alone the carnage. It's enough to make you wonder if he had any concept of conservation, or even basic fairness. Historians still debate whether Commodus's gladiatorial obsession was a genuine attempt to connect with the common people, a twisted form of entertainment, or simply a manifestation of his growing madness and unchecked ego. Was he trying to emulate the popular emperors of the past, who often participated in public games, or was he just indulging in a perverse form of self? You might feel a shiver of revulsion, picturing the emperor, covered in sweat and blood, basking in the cheers of a crowd that was as likely terrified as they were impressed. His obsession with the arena, his self-identification with Hercules, was a key element of his reign, a spectacle that defined his rule and ultimately contributed to his downfall. He was a gladiator emperor in the truest and most disturbing sense of the word. As Commodus delved deeper into his gladiatorial fantasies, the Roman Senate, once a bastion of power and tradition, found itself increasingly marginalized and utterly terrified. You're now in the ornate chambers of the Curia, Julia, the very heart of senatorial power, but the air isn't buzzing with political debate. It's thick with hushed whispers and palpable anxiety. The senators, clad in their togas, sit on the verge of their seats, not out of civic duty, but from a constant gnawing fear of imperial whim. Imagine the discomfort. These proud aristocratic men, inheritors of centuries of Roman republican ideals, forced to applaud their emperor's grotesque performances in the arena. They had to watch as Commodus, in his lion-skin and club, butchered animals and disabled people, then hail him as Hercules. You can almost feel their collective cringe, the slow burn of indignity turning into simmering resentment. They knew that to show anything less than enthusiastic approval was to invite imperial wrath. And Commodus's wrath was capricious and deadly. He was not a man to tolerate dissent, no matter how subtle. The traditional relationship between emperor and senate, a delicate balance of power and deference, had completely fractured. Commodus didn't just ignore the senate, he actively humiliated it. He appointed his corrupt favorites to key positions, bypassing established senatorial families. He would demand vast sums of money for his lavish spectacles, leaving the senators to scramble to fill the imperial coffers. It was a power play, a deliberate chipping away at their authority, designed to leave them powerless and subservient. A mainstream historical fact: during Commodus's reign, several conspiracies against his life emerged from within the senatorial class, indicating the depth of their discontent and desperation. These plots, though ultimately unsuccessful in the short term, underscored the perilous political climate. Now, for a quirky tidbit. It's said that Commodus once executed a prominent senator for merely frowning during one of his gladiatorial displays. Imagine trying to maintain a neutral expression while watching your emperor prance around dressed as a mythological hero, killing an ostrich. It's enough to make you practice your poker face in the mirror, isn't it? This story, whether embellished or not, perfectly captures the suffocating atmosphere of fear that permeated the imperial court. Historians still argue whether the Senate's subservience was a complete surrender to imperial tyranny, or a pragmatic survival strategy in the face of an unpredictable ruler. Did they truly believe there was no alternative, or were they simply waiting for the opportune moment to strike? You might find yourself sympathizing, in a strange way, with these powerful men reduced to quivering Their disdain for Commodus was profound, yet their fear was even greater. The political climate under his rule was one of constant tension, a fragile peace maintained only by terror, and the Senate's growing apprehension would soon boil over, but not before even stranger events unfolded within the walls of the palace. The stage was set, not just for a political drama, but for a bizarre comedy of errors that would make even the most seasoned Roman jester blush. The imperial court under Commodus wasn't merely a political pressure cooker. It was a bizarre carnival of debauchery and unchecked indulgence, a place where the lines between emperor, god, and performer blurred completely. You're now drifting through the marble halls of the palace, the air heavy with the scent of exotic perfumes and the faint, unsettling echo of strange revelries. Here, the usual formalities of Roman power dissolved into a chaotic swirl of eccentricity, fueled by the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior. Imagine the dinner parties. Not the stately banquets you might associate with Roman emperors, but wild, raucous affairs where Commodus might appear dressed as Hercules, or even as an Amazon, flanked by his personal bodyguard Marcia, who he often called Amazonia. You can almost hear the forced laughter of his terrified guests, trying to gauge his mood, to ensure their own survival. It was less a court and more a stage, with Commodus as the sole, unpredictable director. His whims dictated everything, and his inner circle adapted, or perished. Among his favorites was a succession of freedmen and former slaves who, despite their humble origins, wielded immense power due to Commodus's trust, or perhaps, his sheer laziness. There was Clender, a former bath attendant who rose to become his chamberlain, essentially running the empire while Commodus played gladiator. Then there was Southerist, another chamberlain, whose influence was so profound that his assassination plunged Commodus into a paranoid frenzy. These were the true powers behind the throne, operating in the emperor's shadow, manipulating events, and accumulating vast fortunes. A mainstream historical fact, Clender, Commodus's influential chamberlain, amassed immense wealth and power, selling public offices and positions to the highest bidder, a practice that led to widespread corruption and discontent among the Roman populace. His unchecked authority eventually led to a revolt by the people in Praetorian Guard, culminating in his execution. Commodus was reportedly so obsessed with his own reflection that he had mirrors specially constructed in his private chambers, adorned with precious gems, so he could admire himself in various heroic poses. You can just picture him, can't you, striking a pose, club held high, admiring his own brawny image, perhaps even practicing his gladiator growl. It's enough to make you think about those selfie filters and how some things never really change. Just get a historical globe. Historians still argue whether Commodus's reliance on these freedmen was a sign of his complete disinterest in governance, a calculated move to consolidate personal power outside traditional Roman hierarchies, or simply a manifestation of his unstable judgment. Was he truly a puppet of his favorites, or were they merely instruments of his own peculiar will? You might feel a strange mix of pity and exasperation for the Roman citizens, caught in the wake of this imperial circus. The imperial court, once the bedrock of Roman stability, had become a hotbed of intrigue, corruption, and the increasingly outlandish behavior of an emperor who seemed to delight in pushing every boundary. And it was within this volatile environment that the whispers, at first faint, then growing louder, of an even more outlandish imperial desire began to circulate, a desire so peculiar it would defy all logic and reason. The air in Rome, already thick with the scent of strange imperial whims, began to carry a new, even more perplexing rumor. You're walking through the bustling Roman streets, past vendors hawking fresh bread and exotic fruits, past gossiping matrons and hurried senators, and you catch snippets of hushed conversations, a curious phrase repeated in disbelieving tones, "the emperor and a dolphin." It started as a whisper, a ridiculous jest, something too outlandish to be true. But with Commodus, too outlandish to be true was practically his default setting. Imagine the initial reaction. A snort of laughter, perhaps, a roll of the eyes. Our emperor wants to fight lions. Sure, wants to rename months. Fine, but marry a fish. You can almost feel the collective head scratching. The disbelief that quickly morphed into a dawning, horrified realization, because if anyone would entertain such a notion, it was Commodus. His detachment from reality, his insatiable need for novelty and spectacle, made even the most absurd propositions seem, if not plausible, then at least possible. The rumor gained traction, fueled by the emperor's known fascination with all things unusual and his penchant for defying Roman norms. He had already declared himself Hercules. Perhaps he was simply seeking a worthy, equally unconventional, consort. Or maybe, just maybe, he was attempting to prove that his divine power extended even to the very creatures of the sea. There was a story, a fringe tidbit, circulating among the more superstitious of the Roman populace, that Commodus had once dreamt of being pulled from the sea by a magnificent, silvery creature, interpreting it as a sign of his destiny, intertwined with the ocean itself. Whether he genuinely believed this or simply found it a convenient justification for his next grand display, it certainly added fuel to the fire. A mainstream historical fact that lends context to this absurdity. Roman emperors, while technically mortals, were often deified after death, and some, like Commodus, sought divine status during their lifetime. This blurred line between man and God allowed for actions that might otherwise be considered utterly insane, though a dolphin marriage was certainly pushing the boundaries even for a self-proclaimed deity. Now, for a truly quirky thought, you have to wonder what the imperial animal handlers thought about all this. Were they just shrugging their shoulders, muttering, "Another day, another impossible imperial demand"? Were they secretly hoping he'd settle for a very large goldfish instead? It's enough to make you consider a career change, perhaps to professional fish therapists, just to handle the emotional fallout from this whole ordeal. Historians still argue whether the idea of marrying a dolphin originated solely with Commodus, was whispered to him by a sycophantic courtier, or even if it was a deliberate, cynical ploy by an opponent to discredit him. Was it a genuine, albeit diluted, desire, or merely a sensationalist rumor that spiraled out of control, reflecting the public's perception of his madness? You might feel a strange sense of anticipation, despite the inherent ridiculousness of it all, because as these whispers grew louder, you knew, deep down, that something truly unprecedented, truly bizarre, was about to unfold in the heart of the Roman Empire. The stage was set, the bizarre desire had been voiced, and now, the question loomed: how on earth would they even begin to acquire a suitable candidate for such a unique union? With the whispers of a dolphin bride now rippling through Rome like a strange, unsettling tide, the imperial machinery, however reluctant, began to stir. You're now privy to the frantic, hushed discussions behind palace walls, the nervous energy of officials tasked with fulfilling an emperor's most bizarre fantasy. Because when Commodus wanted a dolphin, he wasn't asking nicely, he was commanding. And in his Rome, a command was not to be questioned, no matter how wet and slippery the subject. Imagine the scene at the imperial docks, not the usual flurry of merchant ships and troop transports, but something far stranger. Teams of specially dispatched handlers, likely a mix of bewildered sailors and even more bewildered animal experts, would have been sent out. Their mission: to find a dolphin. Not just any dolphin, mind you. This would need to be a dolphin of imperial caliber, perhaps one deemed particularly intelligent, or beautiful, or, most likely, one that simply looked impressive enough to satisfy an emperor's whim. You can almost picture them, scratching their heads, wondering how to explain this extraordinary procurement request on their official expense reports. Item 1 potential imperial consort, aquatic, justification, emperors, marital intentions. The process of acquiring and transporting such a creature in the ancient world would have been an undertaking of immense logistical complexity. Mainstream historical fact: the Romans were highly skilled engineers and often transported exotic animals for their games and triumphs. But typically these were land animals, often in cages. Moving a live, large marine mammal over a significant distance would have presented unique challenges, requiring specialized tanks or even a complex system of constantly refreshed seawater, likely involving a fleet of smaller vessels. Now, for a truly quirky tidbit, it's said that early attempts to train a dolphin for imperial display involved trying to get it to wear tiny decorative garlands, a notion that likely resulted in nothing but frustrated handlers and very confused cetaceans. You can almost hear the dolphin equivalent of a sigh as it nudges away another absurd floral wreath. It's enough to make you wonder if the dolphin had its own opinions on imperial marriage prospects, and whether it secretly hoped for a swift release back into the open sea. Historians still argue whether the entire dolphin acquisition was a literal attempt to secure a spouse, or if it was merely intended as a grand, unprecedented spectacle, a public demonstration of Commodus's absolute power over nature itself. Was the dolphin a genuine romantic interest, or simply another prop in his ever-escalating theater of megalomania? You might feel a strange mixture of awe and pity for the creature, thrust into such an absurd spotlight. The sea-bound candidate was on its way, a living testament to Commodus's unhinged desires, ready to play its part in what would undoubtedly be the strangest wedding in Roman history. The wheels of imperial absurdity were turning, and there was no turning back. With the arrival of the imperial dolphin, or rather, the intended imperial dolphin, Rome braced itself for the inevitable next act in Commodus's ever-unfolding drama. You're now witnessing the bizarre preparations, a flurry of activity that defies all logic and good taste. The emperor wasn't just planning a casual anchorate, he was orchestrating a full-blown wedding ceremony, complete with all the pomp and absurdity he could muster. Imagine the imperial architects and engineers, usually tasked with designing aqueducts and grand temples, now scratching their heads over how to create a suitable nuptial chamber for a marine mammal. You can almost picture them, poring over blueprints, trying to figure out the optimal salinity levels and the best way to rig a ceremonial arch over a very large pool. No doubt, they'd be muttering under their breath about how this was not covered in their Roman engineering textbooks. The demands were preposterous, but the penalty for failure was severe. The public reaction was a volatile mix of disbelief, morbid curiosity, and quiet horror. Senators whispered behind their hands, ordinary citizens exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the palace staff simply got on with the increasingly surreal business of preparing for an emperor's aquatic wedding. Think about the discussions in the taverns, the jokes, the bewildered attempts to rationalize the unrationalizable. Some might have seen it as a sign of divine favor, others as a clear indication that the emperor had truly lost his mind. A mainstream historical fact: Roman weddings, even for the elite, involved intricate rituals, specific attire, and often public processions. The idea of adapting these deeply human ceremonies for a creature of the sea would have been utterly alien and disrespectful to traditional Roman values. Rumor had it that Commodus's personal astrologer, a man notorious for twisting celestial events to suit the emperor's whims, declared that the stars had aligned perfectly for a union between the emperor and a creature of the deep, carefully omitting the part about it being a literal dolphin. You can almost hear him, can't you, trying to sound profound while subtly nodding towards the emperor's latest obsession. It's enough to make you wonder how much job security depended on saying yes to even the most outlandish imperial pronouncements. Historians still argue whether these preparations were a cynical attempt by Commodus to further undermine the authority of the Senate and traditional Roman institutions, or if he genuinely believed in the spiritual or symbolic significance of such a union. Was he deliberately provocative, or genuinely deluded? You might feel a growing sense of unease as the absurdity escalated. The very fabric of Roman decorum was being stretched to its breaking point, and the impending nuptials were set to be the ultimate test of its resilience. The city, accustomed to spectacles, was about to witness one unlike any other, a truly bizarre display of imperial power and delusion. The closer the fabled Dolphin wedding approached, the more the traditional fabric of Roman decorum began to fray, unraveling thread by thread under the relentless pressure of Commodus's bizarre reign. You're now witnessing the palpable tension in the city, the growing sense of unease as the emperor's eccentricities ceased to be mere oddities and became outright affronts to the established order. The concept of gravitas, that deep-seated Roman virtue of dignity and seriousness, was being drowned in a sea of imperial absurdity. Imagine the high priests, the Vestal virgins, and all the guardians of Rome's ancient religious rites. How would they to incorporate a dolphin into sacred ceremonies? You can almost hear their exasperated sighs, their hushed debates about ancient precedents that surely didn't cover interspecies unions. The very foundations of their religious belief, which held Rome together, were being challenged by the emperor's increasingly outlandish desires. It wasn't just a quirky imperial phase, it was an active assault on the very soul of Rome. The Senate, already humiliated, now faced an unprecedented dilemma. How could they formally acknowledge, let alone participate in, such a spectacle without completely losing all credibility? Their power had waned, their influence dwindled, but their dignity, however threadbare, remained. This was a direct challenge to that last shred of respectability, forcing them into a humiliating public display of sycophancy that would forever stain their reputation. A mainstream historical fact, Commodus's reign marked a significant decline in the respect for the Roman Senate, which had traditionally served as a check on imperial power. His open contempt for its members and institutions contributed to the eventual shift towards more autocratic imperial rule. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some accounts suggest that Commodus insisted on crafting a miniature, jewel-encrusted crown for the Dolphin, convinced that it would understand its elevated status. You can almost picture a bewildered dolphin bumping its nose against a glittering, uncomfortable circlet, probably wondering if it was some new kind of tasty treat. It's enough to make you consider if ancient Roman jewelers had a marine life section in their catalogs. Historians still argue whether Commodus's deliberate flouting of tradition was a calculated move to assert absolute power by demonstrating his disregard for established norms, or if it was merely a symptom of his escalating mental instability. Was he intentionally trying to shock and demoralize the elite, or was he simply lost in his own bizarre fantasy world? You might feel a profound sadness for what Rome was becoming under his rule, a once proud republic now a stage for a madman's circus. The unraveling of imperial decorum was complete, and the stage was now set for the final, most audacious act, one that would push the patience of even his most loyal followers to its absolute limit. As the grand bizarre preparations for the Dolphin nuptials continued, a darker undercurrent began to ripple through the imperial palace and the city of Rome. You're now acutely aware of the palpable fear, the gnawing anxiety that clung to every shadow, as Commodus's reign spiraled further into unchecked madness. Plots, whispers, and paranoia became the daily bread of the Roman elite, a constant, chilling reminder that their lives hung by the emperor's increasingly thin thread of sanity. Imagine the atmosphere during court gatherings. Not a place of pleasantries and political maneuvering, but a tense arena where courtiers eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who would be the next victim of Commodus's whims or his paranoid delusions. You can almost feel the cold dread in the air, the constant tightrope walk of trying to please an unpredictable tyrant while simultaneously trying to stay one step ahead of his suspicions. Loyalty was fleeting, betrayal was rampant, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. Commodus, consumed by his own delusions of grandeur and his increasingly outlandish fantasies, grew increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. He saw enemies everywhere, perceived slights in every glance, and imagined conspiracies lurking behind every curtain. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded, of course. Many did wish him gone, including members of his own family and inner circle who had initially benefited from his rule. The outrageousness of the Dolphin marriage was, for many, the final straw, pushing them from resigned acceptance to active plotting. Commodus survived several assassination attempts during his reign, most notably one involving his own sister Lucilla and other prominent senators. This history of plots only fueled his paranoia and led to brutal purges within the aristocracy. It's said that Commodus began to insist that all food and drink presented to him be tasted by multiple servants, not just one, for fear of poison. He even had a personal food taster who specialized in detecting the subtle flavor of sea salt, just in case someone tried to tamper with the dolphin's celebratory plankton. It's enough to make you think about your last meal, isn't it? And how much simpler life is without the constant threat of a poisoned appetizer. Historians still argue whether Commodus's paranoia was a true psychological breakdown, a consequence of his increasingly isolated position as an absolute ruler, or a rational response to the numerous real threats against his life. Was he genuinely delusional, or was he reacting to a hostile environment he himself had created? You might feel a morbid fascination with the escalating tension, knowing that something had to give. The plots thickened, the paranoia intensified, and the bizarre wedding preparations continued, inexorably drawing Rome closer to a violent and inevitable climax. The emperor's madness, intertwined with the desperate measures of those around him, created a truly explosive situation, ready to detonate at any moment. The day of the farcical ceremony loomed, casting a strange, almost theatrical pall over Rome. You're now a spectator, standing on the edge of a crowd that is gathered, drawn by a mixture of obligation, dread, and an undeniable, morbid curiosity. The atmosphere is less one of joyous celebration, and more akin to a bizarre, unsettling performance, with the emperor himself as the erratic, unpredictable star. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a public declaration of Commodus's complete detachment from reality, a spectacle designed to solidify his unique brand of imperial madness. Imagine the sheer audacity of it all. The imperial court, meticulously dressed, though their smiles were no doubt strained, would have assembled. Elaborate floral arrangements, more fitting for a triumphant general than a wedding, would have adorned the purpose-built aquatic arena, a space undoubtedly filled with freshly drawn seawater, perhaps even heated to a precise temperature for the comfort of the bride. You can almost hear the nervous coughs, the shuffling of feet, as everyone waited for the emperor's grand entrance, knowing that whatever happened next would be etched into Roman history, for better or, most likely, for worse. The Dolphin, whether genuinely trained or simply coaxed by clever handlers, would have been present, probably swimming placidly, oblivious to the immense political and social ramifications of its unwitting participation. Some accounts, a quirky tidbit you might find amusing, suggest that the imperial cooks were instructed to prepare special fish-based delicacies for the Dolphin, perhaps hoping to sweeten its disposition, or, more cynically, to ensure it stayed put during the ceremony. Imagine the culinary challenge, crafting a wedding cake from a marine mammal. It's enough to make you chuckle, picturing a chef in a toga, looking utterly perplexed by the demands, a mainstream historical fact that adds a layer of ironic tragedy to this scene. At this very period, Rome was grappling with food shortages and economic instability, yet vast sums were being expended on Commodus's personal extravagances, including the preparations for this absurd ceremony. This stark contrast between imperial self-indulgence and public hardship only deepened the resentment against him. Historians still argue whether Commodus truly intended to legally marry the Dolphin, or if the entire event was conceived as a highly elaborate, symbolic act of dominance over nature and tradition, designed to shock and awe his subjects into absolute submission. Was it a genuine, if diluted, desire for companionship, or a calculated, tyrannical performance? You might feel a profound sense of absurdity, watching the grand machinery of an empire churn to accommodate such an insane whim. The farcical ceremony approached, a culmination of years of unchecked power and spiraling delusion, and it promised to be a moment of bizarre, unforgettable history, one that would push the patience of even the most long-suffering Romans to its absolute limit. The climax of Commodus's bizarre reign was about to be unleashed upon a bewildered populace, and everyone knew that something had to give. As the curtain prepared to rise on the most bizarre imperial spectacle Rome had ever witnessed, the undercurrents of discontent reached a fever pitch. You're now sensing the shift in the air, the collective tightening of jaws among the powerful, the growing whispers of betrayal that no longer confined themselves to hushed corners. For many, the Dolphin wedding was not just an embarrassment. It was the final undeniable proof that Commodus had become a danger to himself and to the very stability of the empire. Imagine the faces of his closest advisors, the very individuals who had enabled his excesses for so long. They had grown wealthy, certainly, but at what cost? Their own lives, their reputations, and the future of Rome itself now hung precariously on the whims of a madman. You can almost feel the weight of their impossible decisions, the quiet calculations of risk versus reward as they contemplated the unthinkable, removing the emperor. This wasn't a sudden surge of morality, it was pure, desperate self-preservation. Among those closest to him was Marcia, his favorite concubine and a powerful figure in her own right. She had endured his increasingly erratic behavior, his self-proclaimed divinity, and even his renaming of a month after her. But even her patience, and her perceived safety, had. Then there was Eclectus, his chamberlain, and Quintus Aemilius Latus, the praetorian prefect, the head of the imperial guard. These three, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, and fearing for their own lives as Commodus's paranoia spiraled, began to converge, their separate anxieties weaving into a dangerous, unified plot. A mainstream historical fact, the immediate cause for the final conspiracy against Commodus was his alleged plan to celebrate the new year by appearing as a gladiator in the arena on January 1st, 193 CE, a sacrilege to traditional Roman dignity that even his closest advisors could not stomach. This public humiliation would have been the final straw for the Roman elite. Now, for a truly quirky tidbit, some accounts suggest that Commodus had a dream, shortly before his demise, where a furious Hercules, displeased with the emperor's blasphemous imitation, appeared and struck him down with his club. You might ponder the irony, or perhaps the psychological self-fulfilling prophecy of it all, that the very deity he so adored might be the harbinger of his downfall. It's enough to make you consider the power of a good night's sleep, or lack thereof. Historians still argue whether Marcia, Eclectus, and Latus acted purely out of self-interest and fear, or if there was a genuine, albeit cynical, desire among them to restore some semblance of order and dignity to the Roman state. Were they patriots or opportunists, or perhaps a complex blend of both? You might feel the chilling anticipation of impending doom, knowing that once a conspiracy of this magnitude takes root, it's only a matter of time before it blossoms into violence. The whispers of betrayal were no longer just whispers. They were rapidly solidifying into a deadly resolve, ready to extinguish the strange flame of the Dolphin Emperor's reign. The final moments of Commodus's reign were as bizarre and undignified as his life. A strange, frantic prelude to an inevitable end. You're now inside the imperial palace, not witnessing grand spectacles, but the claustrophobic, paranoid final hours of an emperor teetering on the brink. The air is thick with the scent of fear and the subtle, telltale signs of a plot about to unfold. Even as the grand preparations for his aquatic marriage supposedly continued, a much darker, more intimate drama was playing out. Imagine Commodus, in his chambers, perhaps still dreaming of Dolphin nuptials or a fresh victory in the arena. His paranoia was at its peak, and his mood swings were violent and unpredictable. You can almost hear the nervous footsteps of his servants, the hushed tones of his guards, everyone acutely aware that one wrong move, one misplaced glance, could lead to a swift and brutal demise. He was a ticking time bomb, and those closest to him knew it. The conspirators Marcia, Eclectus, and Latus had set their plan in motion. Their aim was simple: eliminate the emperor before he could eliminate them, or before his continued outrageousness completely destroyed what remained of Rome's stability. The irony, a quirky tidbit you might appreciate, is that Commodus had apparently just finished a lavish feast, perhaps even celebrating the impending Dolphin ceremony, when the plot was activated. He was in a state of self-satisfied indulgence, completely oblivious to the impending doom. It's enough to make you think about how often history's greatest falls happen at the peak of hubris. A mainstream historical fact: Commodus was ultimately strangled in his bath by Narcissus, a wrestler, on December 31st, 192 CE. The method of his assassination was likely chosen for its quietness and to avoid public spectacle, contrasting sharply with the emperor's own love of gladiatorial displays. Historians still argue whether Commodus's death was a necessary act of liberation for Rome, or merely a desperate power grab by those who feared for their own lives and positions. Was his elimination a calculated political maneuver, or a reactive act of self-defense against a truly mad emperor? You might feel a strange sense of quiet relief, despite the violence of the act, that the long, strange chapter of the Dolphin Emperor was finally drawing to a close. The climax was swift, brutal, and utterly in keeping with the dark undercurrents of his reign. The era of the gladiator emperor, the would-be dolphin groom, was over, and Rome could at last breathe a collective sigh of something resembling peace. The news of Commodus's death rippled through Rome, not with public mourning, but with a palpable, almost audible sigh of relief. You're now standing in the immediate aftermath, witnessing a city that, for the first time in years, dared to breathe freely. The oppression, the absurdity, the constant fear of imperial caprice, it was all suddenly, miraculously, lifted. Imagine the swiftness with which the Senate acted. The very body that had been so humiliated, so terrified, now sprang into action with a newfound ferocity. You can almost feel the collective urge to erase every trace of the mad emperor. They declared him a public enemy, ordered his statues to be pulled down, his name struck from public records, and his every act condemned. This was not just political maneuvering. It was a furious, cathartic attempt to reclaim Roman dignity, to metaphorically scrub clean the imperial slate. The decree of damnatio memoria, a mainstream historical fact, was applied to Commodus, meaning his memory was condemned and effaced from official records, a testament to the hatred and contempt he inspired. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People openly celebrated in the streets, defacing his remaining images, mocking his gladiatorial pretensions. You can almost hear the cheers, the laughter, the collective outpouring of pent-up frustration and fear. The bizarre tale of the Dolphin Emperor, the gladiator god, was over, and the city could finally begin to heal from the wounds of his erratic reign. It's said that after his death, people would spit on the ground whenever his name was mentioned. Imagine having such a strong emotional reaction that simply hearing a name evokes a physical response. It's enough to make you consider your own historical nemesis, isn't it? And whether they deserve such visceral condemnation. Historians still argue whether the extreme reaction to Commodus's death was purely a response to his madness and tyranny, or if it was amplified by the efforts of his successors to demonize him, thereby legitimizing their own claim to power. Was his memory truly deserving of such condemnation, or was it, in part, a politically convenient rewriting of history? You might feel a sense of poetic justice, watching the swift unraveling of a legacy built on delusion and fear. Rome, for a brief moment, exhaled, ready to turn the page on its strangest imperial chapter, hoping for a return to sanity, stability, and, perhaps, an end to emperors with peculiar marital intentions. Though Commodus was gone, and his name erased from official records, the echoes of his bizarre reign, and especially the peculiar whisper of his dolphin obsession, lingered in the collective memory of Rome and beyond. You're now reflecting on his legacy, a legacy not of military conquest or philosophical wisdom, but of unprecedented eccentricity. He became a cautionary tale, a vivid illustration of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of absolute authority. Imagine the stories that were told, generation after generation, around Roman hearths and in soldiers' camps. The tales of the gladiator emperor, the man who fought beasts and disabled gladiators, the one who renamed Rome after himself, and always, the whisper of the dolphin. You can almost hear the low chuckles, the disbelieving gasps, as the most incredible details were recounted. He wasn't just a bad emperor. He was a fascinatingly bad emperor, a figure so outlandish he defied easy categorization. His reign, though short, had a profound impact on the trajectory of the Roman Empire. Mainstream historical fact: Commodus's death marked the end of the Antonine dynasty, often considered the golden age of the Roman Empire, and plunged Rome into a period of civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors, leading to greater instability and a more militarized imperial succession. Now, for a final, quirky tidbit. Even centuries later, some Roman historians and satirists would slyly reference Commodus's aquatic ambitions when discussing particularly foolish or self-indulgent rulers, using the phrase "one who seeks a bride from the waves" as a subtle, knowing jab. It's enough to make you think about how long a truly bizarre story can survive, becoming a shorthand for madness itself. Historians still argue whether Commodus was truly a singular anomaly, a product of unique psychological factors, or if his reign was merely an extreme manifestation of the inherent dangers and temptations of absolute power within the Roman system. Was he a unique case of imperial madness, or a harbinger of the instability that would plague the empire for centuries to come? You might feel a lingering sense of wonder, perhaps even a strange sort of affection, for the man who dared to be so utterly defiantly different. His dolphin obsession, however real or imagined, became a symbol of his ultimate disconnection from the sober reality of governing an empire, a testament to a mind that preferred the fantastical over the functional. And so, the strange, the shimmering tale of the Roman emperor who tried to marry a dolphin gently fades into the quiet depths of history. The tumultuous waves of his reign have long since calmed, leaving behind only the faintest echo of a laugh, a whisper of a gladiator's roar, and the soft, almost imperceptible splash of a dolphin's tail. The grand chaotic theater of ancient Rome has closed its curtains on this peculiar act.